Well, good morning, everyone. Your Excellency, Governor Baker, Professor Chalmers, the Honourable Justice Shanahan, the Honourable Guy Barnett, the Very Reverend Humphrey, distinguished members of the clergy and the bar and the bench, members of the protective services and other guests. Thank you so much for the opportunity to address this really lovely and important occasion. It's great to be here with you. When I was preparing for today, a colleague sent me an article from the New York Times on decision fatigue. And it was a long piece and it outlined some kind of alarming findings, actually, when it came to our ability to make good decisions, and especially the negative impact of having to make lots of decisions in a short period, and how fatigue and along with our drop in glucose levels that diminish, of course, the further we get from our latest meal, both play a significant role. And there was mention of quarterbacks in football, there was mention of CEOs making terrible decisions, there was mention of stockbrokers and other people. And one of the highlighted cases was of people making decisions on parole boards. And it was found that you were more likely to get parole if your case was heard early in the morning compared to late in the afternoon. So early in the morning, you received parole 70% of the time, and late in the day, less than 10%, which was a little bit alarming for the people in that situation. But the author of the study said, even the wisest people won't make good choices when they're not rested and their glucose is low. The best decision makers are those who know when not to trust themselves. Now, of course, I can't speak to the veracity of that study, and I'm sure it doesn't apply here. But nonetheless, I hope you are all well rested and well fed at the start of this year as you go about your work. But all of it does highlight the human element of the legal system that I want to speak to today as we go. Now, I am intensely aware that I'm speaking with subject matter experts and practitioners in a field that's not my own. Okay, I like Tom Cruise in A Few Good Men. I've watched a couple of episodes of LA Law, and Atticus Finch was a childhood inspiration. So, there's that. But I do think that moments like this are an opportunity to re-examine our first principles, to refresh and deepen and invigorate our commitment to those principles, and perhaps to take advantage of the perspective of an outsider. So I hope that's true. I want to talk about today justice and life to the full, or as it was said in the reading from John, abundant life. So justice and abundant life. The American philosopher Nicholas Walterstorff, who was at Yale for many years, writes about the biblical idea of shalom, which is translated in our Bibles as peace, but it's really an inadequate translation. There's a lot more to this concept. So the concept of shalom that's articulated in the Old Testament poetic and prophetic literature, and also in the New Testament, refers to a state where the human being is dwelling at peace in all her relationships. So her relationship with herself, with other people, with nature, and ultimately with God. And that notion of shalom is intertwined with justice. So in shalom, each person is enjoying justice. They're enjoying their rights. There's no shalom without justice. It includes a kind of delight in the human community. But you can only have that when justice reigns, only when human beings are not oppressing each other, writes Walterstorff. And so the work of the legal system, whether that be high-profile criminal cases or conveyancing work or working through a hearing at the tribunal, whatever it might be, can all be rightly thought of as doing the work of God. Now, that may or may not be something that fills you with enthusiasm, but stay with me for a moment. So the struggle for justice, according to this way of thinking, forms a really important part of the life to the full, the abundant life that Jesus promises to bring. So I did ask for that John 10:10 reading as one of the readings today, where Jesus claims to be offering life to the full. So he's describing life that is related to shalom, where you think of things like relationships being in their right place, and the kind of life that includes the work that you are all engaged in. Now, there are two Greek words for life in the Bible. There's bios, which refers to all physical life, to understand. And for our purposes, it could relate to our legal system, our laws and our processes, the kind of the mechanics of the law, that here in Tasmania are right up there with the best in the world that we can be proud of. The other word for life, and it's the one that Jesus uses in our passage, it's zoe, or referring to another element or perspective of life, in that it contains a sense of protection or restoration. There's hope and healing. It's kind of about redemption and salvation. And I would argue that when our justice system, when our legal system is working at its best, it will capture elements of both. And really, a good legal and justice system is about love of neighbour, isn't it? Which is the thing that Jesus was most concerned about, very concerned about, love of neighbour. So a system that is not subject to corruption or partiality or prejudice is necessary for upholding this ideal of love of neighbour. And of course, it goes beyond just an absence of conflict. Now, it may be that in our rapidly polarising culture that we're all part of, and at a time of huge distrust in institutions that were once considered foundational to our society, that our legal system takes on an even more significant role. Across the world, there is rhetoric attempting to delegitimise courts as biased and political. And I'd say there are numerous and diverse threats to judicial independence around the world. Australia is well placed and in a strong position, but these structures can't be taken for granted. They need attending to be strengthened and cultivated. So a good justice system is related to life to the full. I don't know if you've ever thought of it in those terms. There's also a really important human element to our legal system. Aristotle was said to have written that the law is reason free of passion. Reason free of passion. It's true at one level, isn't it? There is an element of law that is necessarily objective and dispassionate and defined. But there's too much missing from that definition, don't you think? Our legal system shouldn't be free of compassion, for instance. It is about people, and being involved with people involves passion, being able to see people. Empathy and compassion play a crucial role in ensuring fairness and justice. And it's not just those receiving the work of the legal system, but also those administering the legal system who need to be seen as human and to act in humane ways towards each other. You are all human after all, and the example of the decision fatigue at the start speaks to that a little bit. As such, Jesus promises this life to the full. He very much has in mind the central concept of grace as crucial to what he says he offers everyone and what we are called to offer each other in response. And there is grace present in our legal system, isn't there? Judges at sentencing hearings take many factors into account before making the call, no doubt frequently offering grace to people, undeserved kindness and reprieve, considering all kinds of mitigating circumstances. Or we might think about two opposing lawyers and where one misses a deadline for a directions hearing or a litigation deadline, and he cuts the other person a bit of slack. He offers grace. The police are constantly having to cut people some slack or offer grace, making spur-of-the-moment decisions about how to deal with someone, often people at their worst moment, and taking into account things that they might know about that 19-year-old addict that's causing them and others so much grief. All of this is an important part of our system, remembering that the system is made for the people and not the people for the system. Now that's a distinctive of societies like ours. And I think it's an echo of Jesus' teaching against the harsh lawmakers of his day when he said that the Sabbath is made for the people, not the people for the Sabbath. And this grace, as I've framed it, is partly about recognising our own imperfections as we engage with all sorts of people in the system. And if, as I've tried to establish here, a good justice system is about loving your neighbour, we might do well to recall W.H. Auden's line, where he encourages us to love your crooked neighbour with your own crooked heart. Love your crooked neighbour with your own crooked heart. I love that. It's a recognition of our own fallibility. Victor Hugo's novel Les Miserables, most well known today through the musical. I think many of you would have seen that. It tells a story that illustrates something of what I'm trying to talk about here today in making a link between Jesus' promise of a full life and a legal system that contributes to shalom. Many of you will remember the story. So Jean Valjean is this hardened convict. He's a French prisoner who's been transformed in this story by a moment of intense grace. Released after a very long stint in prison, but wandering village roads as an unwelcome felon, he is invited to stay with an old bishop who's offering him shelter. And during the night, true to character, he makes off with all the valuable silverware in the house, but he's arrested the next morning. The gendarmes turn up at the bishop's house with the thief and the stolen goods in tow. But here's the turn. Instead of pressing charges that would have seen Jean Valjean return to prison, probably for life, the bishop turns to him and says, "Oh, it's great to see you. And guess what? You forgot that I gave you the candlesticks as well. Have those too. They're silver like the rest, and they're worth a good 200 francs. And so the gendarmes have to leave, and Valjean is left speechless and shaking. This radical act of grace and forgiveness, defying every human instinct, changes his life completely. It melts his hardened heart. And from then on, he becomes a man of honour who dedicates himself to serving other people in his life. And the story is so powerful and so captivating because it's so rare. But people recognise something beautiful in that moment. The beauty of the redemptive act, opening for someone who's down on their luck a new opportunity, and it transforms their life. I think stories like this provide a provocative and imaginative possibility for all of us in our interactions with each other. Small or large acts of grace that can turn a life around. This is reflective of the life to the full. It turns expectations on their head. It offers new possibilities and potential. Everyone here, there's not anyone here who doesn't recognise the imperfect nature of our legal system and our system of justice. And even when it's working well, there are many people who have been wronged, who will feel dissatisfied with the outcome, or at least not fully satisfied. As I was preparing this, I wondered what this group's reaction would be to President Trump offering a blanket pardon to January 6 rioters, including, I understand, people who'd violently attacked police officers. Some were serving long sentences that had come off the back of long trials with all the work that goes into that. There might be varying views on that topic. We can talk about it later. But then you have situations like the teenager who murdered 3 little girls at a Taylor Swift-themed dance party recently. And this month, he was sentenced to 52 years in jail. But those little girls aren't coming home. And then, of course, sometimes people are wrongly convicted, and the injustice of that must be excruciating for all those involved. I once saw a documentary that included the story of a man who DNA technology revealed had spent 26 years in prison for a murder that his brother had committed. I'll never forget that. All of this, and we're fully aware of heaps of examples of these sorts of things in our lives. All of it leaves us longing for more, longing for something more substantial in terms of justice. And you don't have to be someone working in the areas that you work in to feel that deeply. It's a profound human predicament. Well, what could possibly appease or hope to satisfy our instinct that justice be done, and yet our frustration that it often isn't? The Christian belief is that God will one day put all things to right. That every sad thing will ultimately become sort of untrue, if you like. So this biblical vision of hope that's offered by the Jesus story, it might appear to some as illusory. I had an article in The Guardian this week on death and the way that we do funerals. And I made the mistake this morning of reading the comments below that story. And it was just a reminder that not everyone sees the world in the way that I do, if I needed that again. But nonetheless, there'll be some who think that this is just a sort of a nice kind of bedtime story we tell ourselves because we're afraid of the dark. We want to ward off the thought that there is no ultimate justice, no redemption, and no one coming to save us. But I think that this universal longing that I've been talking about is highly suggestive of what C.S. Lewis called the really real, the thing that's behind the reality that we're experiencing. It's sort of calling us in a kind of way in all its different fashions. Well, how could that help us? Martin Luther King Jr. was fond of a quote that was not his originally, but he became very closely associated with it. And that is, you all know it, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Well, King's rhetoric was inspired by the Old Testament prophets. We heard about them today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low. That's straight out of the book of Isaiah. Or what about this from the prophet Amos? We heard it today. We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. No, I can't do it like him. But nonetheless, the concept of something eternally significant was what drove him to action. It strengthened his resolve. It gave him a perspective such that even significant setbacks didn't deter him. He felt confident that he was participating in work that was part of a transcendent reality. He said it enabled him to keep going when his courage was failing him. Now, this vision that's offered in the biblical text of a world put right, for the person convinced of that vision, it's not merely the idea of perfect justice that powers their faith, but in fact God himself. But it is that also. So it's about hope and trust in the one who sees all, the one who sees all the infinite detail perfectly and will one day sort it all out. And that can power our kind of piecemeal efforts. In fact, it offers a freedom to maybe sleep a little bit more easily, even when faced with the incompleteness of earthly justice. It helps us to be less restless about our incremental advances. You may be an imperfect instrument of an imperfect justice system, but that's okay. And for those who are not convinced by that vision, I think perhaps it can also nonetheless be a kind of fuel for our efforts. The dream of justice that drives the reality now. Now, you have in Tasmania an enviable legal system that is precious and vital to the health of the state and the country. It's worth celebrating it today and remembering its importance and the role that each of you play, big and small, in sustaining it. It is imperfect, of course. It's an enterprise that involves fallible humans administering justice to other fallible humans. As a community, we need to try to get it right because it's part of loving our neighbours. And I would argue echoing the human longing for true and lasting justice, the kind that I think deep down we all sense only God could create. So at the beginning of this year, I wish you all well as you take on your noble task for another year. Thank you.